Great. So this is the Sustainable Communities Climate Change Panel. And if you're just joining us, I was just doing introductions to our amazing panelists this morning.
Wonderful. We're really excited to engage with all of you today. This is just an incredible forum that's provided, and we're kind of creating a shared presentation today. So it's not three separate, but it's an integrated presentation. And so hopefully it'll create a lot of good discussion in the end as well. So let's see. So there are names, and I think our contacts will be at the end as well if you want to get in touch with us.
And I'll just say, if you have any questions, we will be taking questions at the end. Everyone's going to go through their slides, and then we'll have time for Q&A at the end. So just type it in the session tab there on the right-hand side of your screen. And we'll answer all the questions at the end.
Yeah, so as we were speaking with each other as panelists, we were really thinking about the synergies between our different perspectives and our roles in climate change and sustainability. And it all tied back to this interface between the human world and the natural world, and how, you know, we really want to make sure we understand like how we're impacting the environment and the environment impacts us, and that we're one and the same. And so this was kind of a little bit like the central theme that we got to.
Right. I guess first we wanted to sort of highlight how important it is to look at health as a holistic concept. So this concept is called the One Health approach, and it was conceived a long time ago, about 200 years ago, long before COVID-19 changed our world. And it is transdisciplinary. It recognizes that the health of people is closely connected to the health of animals, planets, and our shared environment. So basically, when human populations expand into new geographic areas, we're in closer and more frequent contact with wild plants and animals. And also our contact with domestic animals is important, and it allows for more opportunity for the transfer of disease between animals and humans, which is called zoonotic diseases. These are also including mosquito and tick-borne illnesses. So about 75% of all new and emerging diseases are zoonotic. These are illnesses like SARS, Ebola, malaria, Zika, and now Corona. And it's mainly due to three things: deforestation, extraction of fossil fuels, and agricultural intensification. So climate change worsens the health of our planet, our environment, our animals, including livestock, but also the biodiversity of our planet and our health, human health. And so it's imperative that we shift our paradigm globally from economic health to planetary health. And the climate crisis makes it clear that the US and the whole rest of the world can't sustain a strong economy without healthy people and a healthy planet. In fact, a recent report called The Cost of Inaction concluded that the health costs of air pollution and climate change already far exceed $800 billion and approximately 100,000 lives annually in the US. And this is probably an underestimation, and it's also projected to increase as our world warms. So as the founder of Healthcare Without Harm, Gary Cohen often says, you just can't have healthy people on a sick planet. So the next slide.
If I can just jump in real quick. So that was kind of our global lay of the land on our climate change panel today. So just talking about grounding us in how that there's this ebb and flow between how we impact the environment impacts us, and then these more theoretical constructs of what we try to achieve. So considering that people, planet, profit, and considering the interconnection between ourselves and our and the species around us, we're now going to each talk to you about our types of work, starting with Jill. I'm going to talk to you about incorporating the voice of your community into designing projects, Catherine's going to talk specifically about the profit component of it and looking at how we work within healthcare to make energy and water efficient investments within our built environment and the type of programs that you can do there. And then I'm going to talk to you a bit about more about the people and how it all interacts in partnerships that we do at the local community. So that's the agenda that we will continue to follow throughout the content. And please remember, if you haven't, and if you have questions, to use your chat feature. And thanks again for being with us.
Kelly, that's really good framing. Thank you for providing that. So like we said in the introductions, I'm Jill Horwitz. I work for the Seminole Tribe of Florida. I'm the Climate Resiliency Officer, which is a new position. And it's really interesting. I've worked with a lot of different communities on sustainability and climate change planning in the past throughout my career, but working for the tribe is a different way of thinking. Indigenous populations have been on this land, since time immemorial. So they know a lot about the ecosystems and the environments and how to survive here. And they need to remember that, not to forget it. And there's so much that we can learn from them versus teaching, right? So it's a bit of a give and take, and it's been a really interesting process so far. Leading the climate resiliency program, which is new, the first thing we needed to do is define resilience. Most of us, if you look at the textbook definition of resilience, it's bouncing back from shocks and stressors to some like normal equilibrium. And if any of us have looked around recently, we realize that what's been going on is not where we want to be, right? This is not where we want to get back to after a shock or a stressor. There's lots of shocks and stressors with climate change. And the first thing we need to do is to pave a new path forward, which maybe is looking very far back, right, to what we already know. But it's certainly not where we are right now. And so tribal members have defined resilience with other words, holistic, independence, kinship, community, food, youth, future, water rights, right? Other types of words that talk about their strength, community, and survival. So I think it's really important for each of us, for ourselves, our families, and in our communities to do what Rob Greenfield was talking about, like define resilience for ourselves. Where do we want to be? Broaden that up a little bit in our thinking. So we're not looking just at returning to status quo, because there are a lot of impacts, and these are shocks, but they're also opportunities, depending on how we see them. A lot of us here in South Florida all together, doesn't matter which coast you're on, because we're on different coasts within this panel. We're all dealing with sea level rise, groundwater rise, changing rainfall patterns, tidal, flooding, saltwater intrusion. Oh, and that last one got cut off, but it's ocean acidification. And there's more, right? That's not just that. Those are the water ones. We've got temperature extremes both ways, right? We have more frequent and severe drought, even here in Florida. I know we think about that as like a California issue, but Florida gets droughts too. We have wetland erosion and beach erosion. Whole habitat zones are set to shift by the beginning of the next century. This entire zone will shift up a whole nother zone. So instead of us being, subtropical, this will be tropical, and subtropical will be in northern Florida. So what does that mean for habitats? What does that mean for agriculture? As Dr. Toms was saying, vector-borne diseases, right? And also increased food scarcity. So these are major issues, and they're all sort of interrelated. And when we think about them, through my job, I need to balance thinking about them both through a Western-based science viewpoint and incorporating traditional ecological knowledge. Is that deep listening that's necessary, of not just giving all of this sort of whitewashed climate data to tribal members, but looking at what they already know, what they've learned through legends and from history and time, and listening and seeing the changes that they're already seeing and validating that with what the science says, right? And then coming up with solutions that are holistic. So I challenge everyone to look at traditional knowledge and ecological knowledge as a way to kind of balance what we're hearing, because they are symbiotic. And so one of my main jobs is not just to give information, but also to raise voices. So one part of the program is called Telling Stories, Raising Voices, and we do that through climate conversations. And one of our staff is a tribal member. And so I encourage her to interview other tribal members. And these interviews are just beautiful in what comes up on all different aspects of climate change and sustainability. And then she translates those interviews into published articles in the Seminole Tribune. So this is the first one that's been published. The topic was on food sovereignty, because both these tribal members are in our food sovereignty work group. And it's a really great series that we're starting. I want to make sure that everyone feels comfortable in having their voices heard, right? And that they're engaged in the topic. And then we didn't do it this summer, but I think we're going to do it next summer, is have a summer sustainability book club, which is kind of a great thing to do, because I know it's hard to get together during COVID. And in the summer, it's kind of hot to get together outside. So maybe like a book club is a good idea. You know, maybe hopefully we're not totally burnt out by WebEx and Zoom and all of that by next summer, and we could actually sustain a virtual meeting again. But if not, we'll do it in person. But this book is particularly lovely. I know a lot of groups that have read it. And if you are not part of a group that's read it, I encourage you to read it or to recommend it to others. It's called Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Will Kimler. And it's Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teaching of Plants. She's a botanist that's also a tribal member up in New York. And she blends that science-based and ecological indigenous way of thinking very beautifully in these narratives. So I highly encourage this book. Maybe you'll read it with us next summer. And the other way that we really want to make sure that the community is talking with each other and owning this conversation is by supporting events and opportunities for tribal elders and tribal youth to have time to speak together to each other, because that is something that is being lost in the culture. You know, everything's so fast paced now, and you know, we just become more and more separated. But the knowledge transfer from elder to youth is critical on a lot of aspects, culturally, language wise. Seminole Tribe of Florida members speak 2 different native languages, as well as English and sometimes Spanish and other things, right? So having that knowledge transfer between youth and elders is really important. So we're going to have campfire circles this year, knock on wood that everybody can get together in person and have these climate conversations, so that the elders can share the old legends and the youth can talk about what they're most concerned about with climate change, what they know to be true, what they're seeing, and what they're worried about in the future, and really help to advance maybe some policy action, right? So we're hoping that that's a good space for honest and comfortable space for communication. And the other thing that we're doing is trying to bring this best available science and data to the community in a way that's accessible and really relevant. So one thing that we identified as really urgent is a climate impact that's really urgent is extreme heat. We often think about urban heat islands and extreme heat being something that happens in cities because of asphalt, but actually, like, if you look at Union of Concerned Scientists, extreme heat, they've got wonderful little online tools, super easy to use, that incorporate heat and humidity, which is really important. And they also show what happens if we take strong actions, bold actions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, right? That green downward line in this chart shows what happens if we actually act to reduce emissions, that the future is not as terrible as it can be, right? So it encourages that activism, which I appreciate in science. So I think it's important to do both, not to be completely neutral as a scientist, but go ahead and like speak up and advocate. So I really appreciate that tool, and I encourage you to use it. And you'll see that in the center part of Florida is actually very hot, and there's a lot of days above what feels like 105 degrees. And that feels like over 105 temperature is what is quite dangerous from a health perspective for people with any type of cardiovascular, respiratory, any type of risk, people exercising outside, heat stroke. It's really quite dangerous. And we're going from a situation where we've only had a few of these days historically every year to where we're going to have 30, 60, 80, up to 150 days per year. That's nearly half the year of extreme heat. So it's something that we really need to work on. And the IPCC latest report said that sea level rise is off the charts. There's no turning it back. There's nothing we can do. It will continue to rise for millennia. Pretty scary stuff. But extreme heat is something that we can turn back the clock on, and we don't have to be committed to a horrendous future of days. So it is that this call to action to reduce emissions, because there is something that can be affected by that good work. And the last thing that I wanted to bring up that we're working on is food sovereignty. You know, we kind of see sustainability and resilience as, you know, these pillars like energy independence and reliability, you know, water rights and water sovereignty, you know, land sovereignty, which of course the tribe has extensive land holdings, but it's not nearly the extent of what they had through their ancestral range all the way up through Florida and Georgia and even Tennessee and North Carolina. So as things get worse and hotter, like, you know, they're not able to go back and forth during summer and winters like they traditionally could migrate, you know, back and forth. So being landlocked, you know, is definitely an issue. So there's that food, that energy, water, land nexus. But the one thing that they didn't really have a work group on or a committee on was food. And food is just an incredible part of our daily lives, our culture, and that sense of independence. And certainly, you know, the tribe's health has diminished over the last few generations based on the unhealthy eating from the colonialistic oppression that they have suffered. So taking that back, being reconnected to their traditional foods and healthy eating is really, really important. So we've started a work group to start to talk about that and tour some local gardens and things and get that reconnected into their schools, into their, you know, into their communities. And then, of course, there's all the other things that, you know, we have to do, like master plans and transit studies and putting solar on buildings and stormwater master planning and vulnerability assessments and all that other stuff that, you know, that good climate work that cities and communities do. So it's busy, but it's really good stuff. And I look forward to connecting with all of you on any of those aspects that you find of interest.
So, hi, everybody, and thank you so much, Sara, for having me here today, and the Sarasota County Office of Sustainability. Thanks for that great presentation, Jill. I learned quite a lot that I didn't know. I work with Healthcare Without Harm, an international nonprofit that's been around for 25 years. And at Healthcare Without Harm, our work is premised on the belief that health systems have a moral imperative to protect people from the effects of climate change. We work to accelerate the transition to a low carbon economy while improving community resilience, health equity, and access to care. So our member organization for sustainable healthcare is called Practice Green Health, and it provides a network of 1,200 hospitals across the US, and that includes 20% of Florida's hospitals. Next slide, I think, yes. So hospitals and nursing homes have to ensure that their facilities are able to provide continuous services during extreme weather events, as well as address the social and environmental factors that put communities that they serve at risk. So Healthcare Without Harm is leading a new Southeast Florida Healthcare Resilience Collaborative to build a network among hospitals and to coordinate resilience planning with local governments. We hope to expand this membership into the collaborative to other parts of Florida, including Sarasota, in the coming months. So check back with us. And so by partnering together, health systems and municipalities and community organizations can pool their resources and apply for federal, state, and even private funding opportunities to make sure our communities are prepared for the future. Next slide. So this is a challenge that Healthcare Without Harm has led with other organizations. It's called the Healthcare Climate Challenge. It's an initiative to mobilize healthcare institutions around the world, not just in the States, to protect public health from climate change by reducing their own institution's carbon footprint. And as of June 2020, more than 22,000 hospitals and healthcare centers in 33 countries have committed to take meaningful climate action in 3 areas, or we call them pillars. That's mitigation, resilience, and leadership. So participating health systems have pledged to reduce their carbon emissions equaling to the equivalent of 9 coal-fired power plants and a savings of $3.2 billion in healthcare costs related to air pollution. And we hope to grow this group of healthcare systems over the next months. Next slide. So I'm also on the steering committee of Florida Clinicians for Climate Action, and I wanted to tell you about some of the projects we've been working on lately and are planning to continue to work on. But first of all, I just want to remind some of you who weren't at the summit last year and met Cheryl Holder, that our founder, that FCCA, Florida Clinicians for Climate Action, is a statewide coalition of health professionals who are concerned about the impacts of climate change on Florida's residents, especially those in frontline communities and communities of color. So FCCA educates clinicians and the public and policymakers about the health effects of the climate crisis, and we advocate for a just and equitable clean energy solution. So we always work through an equity lens, and I just put up this pie chart to show you that the climate crisis is a threat multiplier. And what does this mean? Well, about 40% of our health and well-being is not the result of what physicians do or hospitals. It's based on social determinants of health, different factors that impact our daily lives. So our children, the elderly, pregnant women, and individuals with chronic health issues and minority communities are bearing the brunt of the negative health impacts of the climate crisis. And so it's kind of a no-brainer that, as Dr. Cheryl Holder often says, climate solutions are also health solutions. Next slide. So FCCA is collaborating with the Florida Institute for Health Innovation on a CDC-funded project that's called the Florida Environmental Health Hazard Hub. It's built on the model of the previous FIHI, or Florida Institute for Health Innovation Hurricane Response Hub, that you all may be familiar with. You can check it out on FIHI's website. And so the Environmental Health Hazard Hub will be an open access online resource with information about water quality, air quality, and the climate. We'll provide tools that will be available to characterize the access, characterize and assess the geographic environmental health hazards and the health outcomes from these through already existing data and programs. And the hub will strengthen networks. We're going to have a convening probably the beginning of next year that might be interesting to your area, because it will bring together stakeholders on the West Coast to explore the environmental and health hazards of Piney Point and the phosphogypsum stack near Progress Village, which is in Hillsborough County. So next slide. So another project that FCCA is working on is the Heat and Affordable Housing Network. And according to the 4th National Climate Assessment, many southeastern cities are especially vulnerable to climate change compared to cities in other regions. And like other impacts, heat-related risks are not distributed equally. So researchers have identified a nexus of demographic, location, and social characteristics that help define these inequities. And they've coined the term a landscape of thermal inequity. So together with the Schimberg Center for Housing at the University of Florida, FCCA is participating in a NOAA-funded project that will help build this network. And it'll be a multi-sector network of southeastern states, Florida, Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, and we hope to expand this. We'll explore how we can best understand the compounding challenges, as well as potential adaptive capacities to rising temperatures on affordable housing communities. And the goal of the network is to catalyze the production of heat mitigation and response strategies throughout the Southeast that reduce the health impacts and heat risk on affordable housing communities. So the next slide, just quickly, in 2019, FCCA worked with Catalyst Miami, the Clio Institute, WeCount, and other stakeholders who serve under-resourced communities in Miami-Dade County. And we formed the Miami Climate Health and Equity Coalition, specifically to understand what residents and healthcare providers thought were the biggest climate and health threats to them specifically. And so through a series of surveys, focus groups, and interviews, heat and housing was the emerging top concern. So then we established 8 policy priorities that range from energy efficiency programs to advocacy for heat protection legislation for outdoor workers. And now we've put these priorities to work with an even broader coalition, the Miami Climate Alliance. And we're taking concrete action to address these 8 priorities. And then just at the bottom here, this is another collaboration that I worked on representing FCCA. It's a campaign that was led by the Women's Foundation of Miami-Dade County that launched last May, a series of billboards that targeted pregnant women, which is an often overlooked at-risk group, especially vulnerable to the impacts of extreme heat. And we wanted the information to be the most impactful. So we focused on just basics of staying cool and staying hydrated on high heat days. So on to the next slide. I just quickly want to set up my last project that I'd like to tell you about. And the reason for this is to highlight what I think is the most important sector to focus on. That's the transportation sector for counties and cities in order to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. So the latest data from the U.S. Energy and Information Agency showed that 50% of Florida's total greenhouse gas emissions come from transportation. And as you can see from the last greenhouse gas inventory for Sarasota, if you'll just look in the circle there, transportation was 35%, accounted for 35% of the greenhouse gas emissions. And then across the US, it also accounts for a third of greenhouse gas emissions as well. So if we can just rapidly transition to electric vehicles with zero tailpipe emissions, we'll be well on our way to a net zero economy. So we need to build programs that rapidly increase EV charging infrastructure and electric vehicle purchasing in the public and private sector. So transitioning EVs positively impacts frontline communities the most by reducing air pollution where they live in the near term and reducing greenhouse gas emissions to slow climate change in the long term. So we need to ensure that this transition to electric vehicles is also equitable. So next slide. So gasoline fueled cars produce also produce, in addition to greenhouse gases, air pollution. So CO2 increases ground level ozone, fine particulate matter, and nitrogen oxides, which lead to cardiovascular and respiratory illnesses, including asthma. And they provoke asthma attacks. So respiratory illnesses impact all populations, but children, women, and communities of color are disproportionately impacted. In fact, Black women have the highest rate of asthma, and more have died from asthma than any other group, according to the American Lung Association. So many of Florida's low-income children and pregnant women often suffer from poor health because they simply don't have reliable transportation to regular healthcare appointments so they can keep these chronic illnesses like asthma under control. So I'm really excited to share with you a new nonprofit called Green Cars for Kids, which will provide free transportation with electric vehicles to non-emergency healthcare services for children and expectant moms who have limited or no transportation. So it's modeled after Kid One, which is a nonprofit organization that has been successfully serving Alabama's families for 24 years. And the pilot program for Green Cars for Kids is planned to launch in St. Pete, but the goal is to expand it to as many areas as quickly as possible. Next slide. I'm winding
Sorry,
down.
Catherine, we're running a little tight on time. Your slides are amazing. And there was a question in the chat about if we would have access to them later. And yes, we can definitely send those out to all attendees. But I want to give Kelly the last couple minutes to do her slides, and then we might have time for 1 or 2 questions.
Absolutely. Go, take it away, Kelly.
Thanks. So we'll real quick, just wanted to bring it home and talk about a few of our partnerships going on in Sarasota County if you're not familiar, or if you hear something today that you want to join in on. The biggest initiative that we have to address climate change, promote sustainability, is called Partners for Green Places, and it works within nonprofit organizations to reduce their energy and water consumption. All the financial savings from their reduction in their utility bills allows them to put more funding back into programs to help people in our community. And it's a really fun model. We've established a facilities audit. That audit is then the game plan that the nonprofit, their board of directors, can use to improve their built structure and have kind of a long range strategy. One of our shining star nonprofits is Girls Inc. If you're not familiar with them, they're on Tuttle Road, just south of Fruitville. And they're an after school and summer program for young women. And they have the largest solar array in Sarasota County. They have a beautiful compost and garden system set up by Sunshine Community Compost. And the girls that are in that in their programs are really just the next generation of our conservationists and climate advocates. They are so smart, so well informed, and getting this great hands-on material. And then we're also out in the community. We're working at the Housing Authority, again, in that low income healthcare disparity, trying to address those issues by going out and talking about things that people can do within their own home and within their larger housing communities. Next slide. And just we're here, there's a lot going on as you're thinking about what you bring to the table. We always say in partnerships, what's your strength that you can bring to the table and complement what somebody else is doing well. So just think about what change you want to be, what strengths you have, and how you can assemble your resources, your partnerships to do your piece to address what we all know we need to do to make our planet healthy and happy. So with that, we'll continue to open up for questions. And I think there's one already in there for Dr. Toms, correct, Sarah?
Yes. And I just wanted to make one point. Thank you, ladies. This has been fabulous and just really great information. I think we could talk about this all day. Before we go to questions, I did see one in the chat. And if you have any questions, please, we still have a couple more minutes. Type them in the chat and I will get to them. One point I just wanted to make though, and the question that I had is, how can organizations connect the climate, health, and equity and funding proposals? And one of the reasons why I really wanted to bring Kelly into this conversation is because Kelly's been such a great resource for us to fund sustainability projects. And that has just been amazing. So I was just hoping you could maybe touch on that a little bit, Kelly, and talking about how we can incorporate health and equity into funding sustainable projects.
Sure, absolutely. And I'd like to recognize our other funding partners that are here as I give this answer: Selby Foundation, Community Foundation of Sarasota County, Gulf Coast Community Foundation, our city and county governments. I think it's the hardest part that we have found is really explaining it to our board of directors, how it's a win-win-win, that when you're making an investment into the built environment, it's going to have an impact on someone's health, say at asthma. So when we're going to the Sarasota Housing Authority and saying, if we seal their attics and change their soffits, that's going to reduce their energy expenses, save them money on utility. It's going to make their air cleaner. And it's also going to harden this place for a hurricane, and really finding that voice to make it salient and compelling, and then also being able to demonstrate the return on investment. So is it that I'm looking at the utility bills? Is that my ROI? Is the ROI the health screenings that we're going to be doing? So making sure that as you're looking at these integrated strategies, that you're very clear with what you're trying to achieve and how you're going to measure. That's what we found has been the hardest part to communicate to the board and to a funder, but also where you get this just great return and combo deal, really.
Thank you, Kelly. I'm going to jump into the questions. So Darcy, for Dr. Toms, do any of the FCCA's campaigns promote tree cutter as a potential mitigation tactic for adverse birth outcomes? It's a great question. Thanks, Darcy.
Specifically for adverse birth outcomes, no, but the Miami Climate Alliance, that is one of the 8 primary policy goals is tree cover. And Miami, with our chief heat officer, Jane Gilbert, that is a primary point. And I just wanted to go back to Kelly's point that she is so spot on about being able to work with communities and across specialties and sort of break down our silos and work together. That reminded me of another program that Healthcare Without Harm has just launched in Virginia, that they identify people who have been in the hospital. Social workers talk to them before they're released, and they ask them specifically about their living conditions at home. Do they have air conditioning? How are they insulated? What's their electric bill? Do they rent? Things like that. And if they identify these people, then they have them connect with a community organization that specifically addresses energy efficiency. So that's spot on what you just said, Kelly. And those are ways that we can really get bang for our buck, not only reducing costs across the board for the community, but also improve health.
And I think to Jeff's question in the chat, that's also your strategy to take out the politics, right? You just say, well, like what I think Miami was one of the great examples in Florida is like, say what you want about sea level rise, right? Their streets in downtown didn't flood 3 years ago. At high tide and a rain, their streets are now flooding. So say what you want, there's water. So just to localize it and to show the data and the proof points from your own communities, I think takes a lot of the politics out of it. It's like, you have an infrastructure problem, you have water in your on Main Street. So I don't know why it's there. We do, but say what you want, right? Just go straight to the facts is how I have found to take the politics out of health and healthcare and the environmental discussion.
Yeah, that's a great point, Kelly. And also focusing on the economic impacts. Our utility rates are going to increase dramatically in the next year or two. We try to work with businesses and nonprofits and residents to figure out how they can reduce their bills, because that's going to be a huge issue in the future. Well, not in the future, just coming up in the next couple of years. We're out of time. I wish we had a lot more time. You all have been amazing. Thank you so much to our panelists today. I'm going to ask everybody to head back now to the stage area. We are going to have a couple announcements from our MC before we take a break. So thank you, ladies. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having us.